In this truck brain dump, I want to talk a little bit about how we organize our boundary drawings here at Redefined Horizons. That's important for a couple reasons. One is it allows us to work in parallel on the drawings for the same survey or the same job, same project. So that allows us to turn mapping deliverables around more quickly than a lot of other companies. So the way we structure our drawings is important for that reason. Number two, so that's number one. Number two, way we work with the data inside of our boundary drawings is actually part of the process that we go through to resolve the boundary. So the drawings actually contain some of the calculations and in some sense encode the decisions that we're making as part of the boundary resolution in the actual location and configuration of the drawing entities of the lines and points. So that's very important. It's important for that reason. We want to make sure that we document that properly. Let me think here. There's probably a third reason. So I talked about working in parallel. Another related, so we could call this number three, is the way we structure our boundary drawings allows us to reuse a lot of drawing elements. So that obviously speed things up. It speeds things up. That reuse makes us more efficient and faster. It also eliminates sources of error. So we don't have the same data duplicated in multiple drawings as a general rule. I've worked at other companies where that's been a real problem. Something changes and a line moves, but it doesn't get moved in all the drawings that it should get moved in. And then a set of plans goes out with a mistake, example. So we don't have that problem here because we reuse what we call our base drawings. And so talk about that a little bit. And we organize our topographic mapping and our utility drawings in a similar way using a similar method. So you'll see this pattern repeated across our business. But I want to talk specifically about boundary drawings today because that's most of what we do. So we're primarily boundary drawing. I'm sorry. We're primarily boundary surveyors, so we don't do a lot of construction. And when we do topo, it's usually with a UAV or it's with a terrestrial scanner or with a UAV. We don't do a lot of topo data collection with the total station or a GNSS rover unless we're doing work on utilities. So let me give you a quick overview of how we organize our different boundary drawings. So we have what's called our base drawings. So that's our boundary search drawing and our boundary line work drawing and our boundary annotation drawings. And sometimes we have a boundary calc drawing. Could talk about that. That would also include all of our map and deed COGOs. So those are all what we call base drawings. And the reason they're called base drawings is because they're the base that our other drawings are created from. So then we have a separate folder actually in our job folder structure that we use to store our what we call our deliverable drawings or our mapping drawings. The folder's called mapping. So that would be like our record survey sheets, our Alta survey sheets, our land description plats for doing land descriptions. So those would all be in the mapping folder. The boundary drawings, the base drawings, are stored actually in the boundary folder. So when you go into the boundary folder, we have a COGO folder. That's where we keep our map and deed COGOs. So that's when we draw the geometry of a survey map or a land description in a deed. Those are typically the drawing files are named to match the document that they draw, essentially. And those drawings are fairly basic. So they usually only have lines. They might have some bearing and distance labels, but that's basically it. So they don't get much fancier than that. So there's no points typically, and there isn't any sophisticated annotations. We might annotate closure errors in those drawings, but other than some bearing distance labels, some curve labels, and some labels marking some closure errors. That's basically it. So they're fairly text to light, they're annotation light, and they're just mostly the geometry, the lines and the curves. Okay, so after we've assembled the Kogos, those are put together in what we call a boundary search drawing. So the boundary search drawing is usually the next drawing we create after we've done the Kogos. And that's usually done after we've already completed some field work, because what we do is we XREF in our points from our boundary field survey after they've been gone through our raw data management. They've gone through Trimble Business Center and we have final adjust coordinates, point coordinates. Those get put into a point drawing and they get XREF'd into the boundary search drawing. So we have our points. And what we do is we place each individual Kogo on those points. Now, when we can, we try and place each Kogo on a set of monument points. If we don't have monument points because we weren't able to find any monuments, then sometimes we will place a Kogo on an adjacent Kogo that's placed on monuments. So we call that record bridging. Now, in a lot of companies, that's where the boundary survey would stop, but that's not how we do things at Redefined Horizons, because we actually try and resolve boundaries. So we put together the boundary search drawing. So it's what a lot of companies would call a record boundary. Okay, so what do we use that for? That's primarily used for two things. One is to search for additional property corner monuments, or to go back and look again for property corner monuments we didn't find with some pretty accurate search coordinates, within a foot or within a couple feet or within a few feet, depending on the area that we're working in. We can go back with the GNSS rover or total station and stake out the property corner location based on the geometry, the record geometry in our Kogos, and we can usually get pretty close. So if we can't find a monument, but we're worried that it's there, maybe we couldn't find it because there was interference from a chain link fence or there's some other circumstance at the search location that made it difficult to look for the monument, we will try and go back with a survey grade coordinate. Now, we always try and look first without coordinates, and there's different reasons for that. That's something that Dave Woolley taught me. We don't want to be too coordinate dependent in our monument search. But one of the main reasons that we create a boundary search drawing is so we can create reasonably accurate search coordinates when we go back a second time to look for property corner monuments. Okay, the second reason we use that we create a boundary search drawing is we use that as the basis for our boundary calc drawing or our resolve boundary drawing. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The third reason we create that is we'll actually use that. It's helpful when you're adding your record reference distances to your resolve boundary drawing. We're typically doing that in a boundary anno drawing. So we might have our measured or calculated distance, and then we might show the most recent record or the distance in our vesting grantee legal description. So it's nice to have the search drawing, helps you identify the line and get the appropriate distance. And then the fourth reason we might create that boundary search drawing is, depending on the project, we might not be fully resolving all those parcel boundaries that are reflected in the boundary search drawing. So if we're doing a monument preservation project, or we're doing a record land net for a large right-of-way corridor, then we might not be fully resolving all those boundaries. So that it depends on what we're doing for the client, but 85% of the time at our company, Redefined Horizons, it's not just my company anymore. We have 16 people. At our company, we're typically fully resolving boundaries. Because that brings us to the next two types of boundary drawings, the next couple. One is a boundary calc drawing, and one is a boundary resolve boundary drawing, resolve boundary line work drawing. So a boundary calc drawing is going to be where we do calculations. And it's going to have some calculated line work and some notes, held this corner monument, held this angle, held the record position of this corner per this map. Those will usually be multi-liters. And the whole purpose of that drawing is so that somebody can get into CAD and retrace your steps. Now that we hope that whatever mapping deliverable we produce, whether it's a record survey or an Alta survey, will contain enough information so that you don't need our boundary calc drawing. That's the goal. So it's really an interim product. It's not a client deliverable. It's to help us bridge the gap in time between the boundary search drawing and the actual mapping deliverable. So it's like a record that we're keeping, an internal record. We want the drafter to be able to refer to that boundary calc drawing when they go to do the boundary annotations for the boundary annotations for the boundary anno drawing and the notes for whatever the mapping deliverable is. So that's our boundary calc drawing. A really good example of that is if we're doing a forest survey, maybe we have some adjacent surveys located on some monuments, some section corners and quarter corners or other allocal corners in the public land survey system. And but the whole section hasn't been mapped. We need to break the section down to locate some of our lines. Then we would do that. That wouldn't be done in the boundary search drawing because there isn't going to be a record there. There's not an existing record, a deed or a map. So we're going to do that in the boundary calc drawing. That's where that should be done. We don't want kind of those messy notes and calculations in our final boundary drawings. That's why we keep those in the boundary calc drawing. Okay, so let's talk about the two types of base drawings for what we call our final boundary. And that's after we've done all the calculations and evidence analysis and all the stuff that we do. And we think we've come up with a resolved boundary where we think the boundary is based on the best available evidence. That goes into a final line work drawing. And we have some rules for that drawing, right? So the line work has to be clean. There can't be any gaps or overlaps or closure errors unless a really special circumstance applies. Can't have overlapping lines. Everything needs to be layered appropriately. There's no COGO blocks or XREFs. It's just the final resolved line work, the curves and lines that represent the parcel boundaries. It has tie lines and it might have lines for joiner boundaries. Sometimes we'll mesh in some GIS parcel line work around the edges of our survey area. But if it's in the final boundary line work drawing and it's on what we call a survey grade layer, it better be right. Like that better be good data. Otherwise, it better be in the boundary search drawing or the boundary calc drawing. So if it's in the boundary line work drawing and it's on the lines, boundary, subject parcel fee layer, then it better be in the right spot. If it's not in the right spot, then don't put it in. We don't put it in that drawing on that layer. And then the boundary annotation drawing, the final boundary annotation drawing is going to have all the relevant symbols and labels for the resolved boundary at a particular scale. And we usually have one or two scales that we're working with on a project, sometimes three. We try to keep them to a minimum, but so we'll have two or three different boundary annotation drawings. They're named with the scale, so 40 scale or 100 scale or 500 scale. And those have the bearing distance labels with the line identification numbers, the curve identification number, and it has the record references. And then it has our monument labels, and it has the parcel labels, the joiner labels, the road names, the road widths, right-of-way widths, and any other relevant notes that we want to include boundary in the mapping deliverable. So those go in the boundary anno drawings. Now, just briefly, I'm not going to get super into the weeds here, but briefly, we then, when we go to create the mapping deliverable, so we'll have let's say we're doing a record of survey, we'll have each sheet in the record of survey is its own drawing. And then in the map sheets, so let's usually, in our company, it's usually like sheet 2 or sheet 2 to 4, or 2 to 5. Each map drawing will XREF in the base drawings for the final boundary. So the line work and the annotations, and that allows us to reuse those. And there's some tricks to get that to work right, so you don't cut labels off and have overlapping labels. But we're pretty good at it. All right, the last thing I wanted to say, I think, is that when we do the boundary search drawing, there's some important documentation that needs to go on that. So we want to make sure that we've included that we have an insert record put together. So the insert record just documents how each COGO block, either map or deed land description, is placed in the search drawing. So we want to know where was it anchored and how was it rotated? How did it fit with the other data? So that goes into the insert record. You can put any relevant notes you want in there. That allows us to reconstruct the boundary search drawing. And you should be able to take the insert record and reconstruct the boundary search drawing without having to ask somebody questions. That's the goal. And then we have some information that we're going to put in that drawing about the way we've scaled things to grid. There should be some information about the scale factor in that drawing. And on some of our big jobs, we might have more than one scale factor for each area of the search drawing. So that it's important that the boundary search drawing have that information, just like it's important that the boundary calc drawing have information about the calculations that were made. I'll close by saying we don't do a perfect job of this. So it requires discipline and housekeeping, and there's always room to improve. We have room to improve, but that's the basic description of how our system for boundary drawing works in theory. The reason I wanted to do this recording is because my surveyors are really good about following the workflows that we have and using our templates and our folder structure, but they may not always understand why. So that's why we organize data the way we do. It has to do with the process that we go through to resolve a boundary, and we want to make sure that we're taking good notes and preserving good documentation at every stop in that, at every step in that process or that workflow, so that we can reconstruct it and answer questions about how we did our work. So it's partly a documentation thing, and it's also the way we organize those drawings is a key to reusing data and being able to work in parallel, which makes us faster and more productive. That's an important part of our business model. So none of that system is designed by accident. It's all very deliberate. I hope this recording helps some of my young aspiring land surveyors to understand the overall way we structure our drawings. I probably have forgotten a few things. I'm sure Elena will listen to this and be like, forgot this, or you said that, and that's not how we do it anymore. But that's okay. I think this will be the basic outline. And like I said, I hope it helps folks.